Hello, it's Nathan from Serious Geeks, and today's Tactica is going to be a little bit different, and it's going to be a review of the Q&A by the Warhammer 40,000 design team. With a change in edition, we often have a lot of drastic changes in the rules, and the design team have clarified some points and pointed us in the right direction with others. This Tactica is going to mostly focus on the rules, so I'm not going to go too far into Crusade, because that seems like more like a narrative way of playing, and would probably be best off for a discussion in its own right. The rest of the format will be myself going over some of the larger questions in more detail, as well as my actual thoughts on each answer and the direction of 40k rules in general. I will be paraphrasing at times, so don't expect a transcription or blow-by-blow account of exactly everything that was said. It's not always necessary, so we'll just get the information out there that we need. So without any more playing for time, the very first question was, what can fans of Horde armies look forward to in the new edition? This was a reference to some of the preview information that was given out to people regarding tanks being able to shoot into combat, etc. So, one of the things that the designers said was lots of things that are going to help assault armies and Horde armies. So they actually answered assault armies in addition to the Horde armies part. They clarified they want terrain to have a more meaningful role in games. One of the things it'll do is block line of sight more using the obscuring tag. So there'll be no more shooting through, and the example they gave, 3 windows and a postbox to wing a Carnifex. They also mentioned that lots of scenery will have different rules ascribed to them at the beginning of the game to give more flavour, and they do go over that in a bit more detail later on. Stu, one of the designers, even used an example of new core stratagems to assist you once you get across the battlefield and do your damage, making sure it's worth getting there in the first place. In this section, they also mentioned how Overwatch is going to have changes, including falling back as well. So that would be stratagem support from the core rules, but they haven't actually explained how that will be affected into the game going forward. My opinion on this, I'm all for it. I'm actually really happy that they've addressed these points and looked into it seriously and haven't just palmed it off. The comment made, shooting armies will have to work for their line of sight, was very important. I think it states their understanding of the issues of the actual game itself of 8th edition, and I'm really positive that this is going to be a very important change for all of us to take into consideration, because we shouldn't just have to use a single phase or 2 phases in the entire game. We should work in most of the phases to get our wins, be it movement, psychic, shooting or assault. And armies that take advantage of all of those things are probably going to be stronger, and I'm all for that. Ultimately, bringing assault back into the game in a good way, in a strong way, is going to be great for everyone. I mean, how many people need swords on their sergeants nowadays? They look good. It's good to have a sword on your Imperial Guardsman. It's good to have your Dire Avenger X-Arch armed with close combat weapons, but there's no reason to do it in a game. And to build up the theme of everyone's army by having close combat as a relevant part is very important, and I'm really all for that. So we shall see how the rules progress with that, but here's me crossing my fingers. The next question was, are there changes to the turn mechanic? The answer was no. They believe that the system is great already and they just built upon it. Moving on, how will strategic reserves work in practice? It was mentioned that you can spend CPs, command points, to put units into reserve, and they're building upon the idea as a commander you can use command points to do things your general would do and not just what the units would do. Reserve units can come on from either your board edge or the sides, which will help melee and close range units and armies in general, because you can get to the enemy a lot quicker without being attacked, particularly when you're flanking someone. Now, strategically and tactically, I'm all for this as well. It changes the dynamic of the game. It means that if you want to move up the board, you have to worry about the flanks, which means you will need more infantry or troops to be able to not throw away as such, but to guard against those points. It's a lot more realistic. If you just go elites heavy and just rush up the board, you are going to be outflanked and it's going to be quite painful. So I think that this is a great balancing aspect to the game, and it also gives a little bit of hope to people who come up against a Tau gun line or an Astra Militarum parking lot, which is, if you want to know the explanation, a load of vehicles and tanks that just sit there shooting at you. Whilst on that subject, the next question was, can you go into more depth about how terrain works? And they did stipulate that terrain is not just there to block line of sight. It's there to be much more fun, much clearer, and they want us to interact with it each game. It'll be clean and simple. The example they gave was the obscuring tag that will block whether you can see or not. They mentioned they wanted variants, so woods are different to buildings, which are different to bunkers, which are different to swamps. As we know in the current 8th edition rule set, in cover just gives you +1 armor save, which is useful at times, but for a lot of games, it's just pointless. It's nice to have, but not essential. Now, with the obscuring tag and probably other tags as well, it means that your terrain will actually have an effect on your movement up the table and what your army can do. So again, this helps assault armies, but it also helps armies that have close range firepower or units that are trying to protect themselves from certain attention and take objectives or move into stealthy positions for later on. It's another very positive change and one that I look forward to seeing the details on. There was the specific question of what does the new edition do to help Tyranids, which is very specific. People could have asked that on any faction, but what was answered was anything tanks can do, monsters can do, if not better. Now, I know a lot of people online are saying that they're going to have additional benefits or bonuses that other units won't have, and I don't think that was in the context of what they were talking about. They were talking about how monsters are quite frightening to face because they can shoot and fight in close combat, and that is all that is referenced to. Basically, they have the same rules as shooting into combat and not being tagged by a single Gretchen or whatever, but they also have better stats in close combat normally. Now, this is in line with what monsters often are, and it means people like Gilliman are actually going to be quite interesting to face, because he can actually shoot into combat as well as hack people into pieces. I dread to think what Hive Tyrants and Carnifex are going to be like, but that's going to give a new lease of life to an otherwise not as utilised unit such as the Carnifex, which I absolutely love the model and concept for. Alongside being able to charge up the table with more generous rules for terrain, as well as being able to outflank, etc., I imagine Tyranids and a lot of armies that go monster heavy, which you could also use in reference with Dreadnoughts, hint hint nudge nudge, I think they're going to be a lot more powerful. I'm actually a major Dreadnought fan, so being able to take all sorts of Dreadnoughts, outflank them to get them up the table, being able to charge into combat more often, plus being able to shoot whilst you're there and not being tagged, it just makes those units a lot more effective, and I'm all for that. Very positive change, very happy. It was then asked how missions and scoring might be changing. The answer was more balanced missions, making sure it's the players winning the battle. They also talked about a little bit later on that there are different missions for different sized games as well as different table sizes, which I think will be quite interesting, as we will see 1500 points games potentially being very different to 2000 point games. Someone asked, are random amount of shots still a thing? And the answer was yes. Blast weapons will even out the random element, but they are still a thing in the game and they like the tension it builds. To be honest, I'm actually not too upset about this. Random elements were useless against horde units, but not as bad against smaller or elites units. And yeah, with Blast, that actually compensates for that element, so that means that the random shots are not going to destroy your game. You either roll really bad or you roll really well. Also, I'll be interested to know what frag missiles do from Space Marine Devastator squads. They did mention later on that there'll be an appendix at the end of the book, the rule book, that defines which existing weapons get the Blast special rule. Little point doing any speculation, but it is always fun to do. I'm hoping that our Space Marine Devastators can enjoy the Blast special rule, not just on plasma cannons, but things like missile launchers, which will give them a real role for clearing out hordes. When you consider a Devastator squad of 4 missile launchers will actually be firing 4 lots of frag missiles, that is 24 shots. That will go some way to clearing out a horde unit, that's for sure. I think those horde units are going to want to use cover, which also leads me to whirlwinds. I actually really look forward to using my whirlwind on the table. It's going to get approximately 12 shots, depending on the rules. And that's going to be very effective. 12 shots a turn, powering away out of line of sight against horde units. I can't wait. Anyway, moving on. Can chapters like Space Wolves use the new models for Primaris? Yes, obviously, was the answer. I mean, let's be honest, why wouldn't they be able to? There was also clarification on Death Watch at this point. They have plans in their head and they are listening to the fans, so pretty much soon after the ninth releases, we'll see the fruits of their labours. This will be interesting to see what Death Watch get. That's going to be new. I don't think it's just going to be the new models. I think they're going to also need some new stratagem support, because all the other armies got it in Psychic Awakening, but Death Watch didn't. I mean, sure, they did get some new stratagems, but it was just the basic stock ones from the basic Space Marine Codex, which everyone got. They didn't get any new flavour just for themselves, so that would be very interesting to see what they get. It was clarified next, the question close to my heart: are old Marines still okay to use? The answer was yes, of course. The head of 40k himself has 2 battle companies of Marines and 1 of Primaris, and he's going to be using them all. He doesn't see why anyone else wouldn't. And then it was mentioned, and that's coming from the head of 40k. It doesn't mean we're going to get any new models, but at least we know that we're going to have decent rule support. The next question was a little bit confusing. I'm not sure who Greg is, but can Greg give his Death Company chainswords? The answer was, don't worry Greg, we've got your back. I presume he's referring to Death Company Primaris, because normal Death Company already have chainswords. But yeah, I'm guessing that they've already sorted that out now with the release of the new intercessors with bolt pistols and chainsword. On that note, it's probably a good time to mention that they also talked about Astartes chainswords being better. Now, it was a little bit unclear whether they were referring to better because of the actual model being strength 4 and larger, and in the background they're obviously bigger. There was a bit of banter on that, and there was mention of all Astartes chainswords being better, but we don't know if they meant that Astartes with a capital A or Astartes with a small case A. And what I mean by that is we don't know if they were referring to the new models having Astartes chainswords, or in general all models having Astartes chainswords just because of the background. However, they did say it will have a different stat line. So the intercessors, at the very least, are going to have a different weapon in close combat to other Astartes at the moment. Although it could be, using the appendix at the back, it could be spread out to everyone, which I think would give Assault Marines a new lease of life. And my Vanguard veterans, who are already very powerful, would really enjoy it. It also makes things like bikes, particularly the new bikes, but also the existing bikes, who can all have chainswords, very effective. Black Templars players, I'm pretty sure they're going to be rejoicing on that, as will Space Wolves, and probably Blood Angels as well, who already get quite good benefits themselves in close combat. Next question was a bit of a cheeky one. What other major players will return this edition? The answer, of course, was really big and exciting ones. And then it was pointed out that you can't peek between the wrappers of presents under the Christmas tree, and they can't reveal everything on day 1. It was pointed out it's day 3, but they went back to the Christmas tree analogy. So we're not getting any other reveals, I'm afraid. It was then pointed out that the Forge World rules are being covered by the 40k rules team. I believe that was already common knowledge, I'm not sure. And Forge World books are coming, so we will see all sorts of new, weird and wonderful units coming that way. And they'll be in line, as used as an example, the Death Core of Krieg. They will be in line with the rest of the game. All books will be usable, including Vigilus, and the rules for new Necrons and Space Marines will be in the boxes and the new Codex books. Some quick fire questions there. Another quick fire answer: everybody can hit on 6s, which is very important, I think, for the whole game. It was then explained a little bit later on that there will be no more shenanigans with multiple stacking penalties to hit from Elder Flyers and other units, because it would be capped at +1 and -1. Now, they said that modifiers are capped in such a way. They didn't basically explain whether this means just hit modifiers, although it was implied such because that was the discussion they were having. And they've also cleaned up how flyers interact, like not going to block line of sight with their bases, which is all a bit gamey. So these ideas I'm going to lump together because they're all kind of similar. Everyone hitting on 6s doesn't really help the elite armies because they'll very rarely get to 6 anyway. Helps the other units, I'd imagine. Some of the ones that hit were a lot poorer, but more importantly, modifiers are capped, never better or worse than +1 or -1. which I think is a great change. It really helps my Space Marines. My Ultramarines can fall back out of combat, which looks like it might be a really good ability, considering that there's going to be core stratagem support hinted at earlier on. And they'll only have a -1 to hit for for the ability itself, which means heavy weapons won't have an additional -1 to hit. So they'll still hit on 4s, which is very effective for our vehicles. Obviously, it remains to be seen whether we want to stay in combat and carry on shooting, because vehicles can do that now, or whether there'll be modifiers to do that as well. Can't wait to see. Anyway, going back to the questions, the last edition rules were over 8 pages. Is this one going to be the same, or will it have more? And it was expanded a little, they answered. They got more examples, so it's obviously going to be bigger from that, but they think the rules are still tight, and there will be an appendix for odd circumstances in the rare rules section at the back. So again, they can keep the rules simple and easy to play for 95% of the game, and then when there are these odd scenarios coming up, we can check the rare rules section at the back. Again, that's a good, clean way of playing the game, and it's kind of logical from a rules writing perspective. It was also asked what changes come into the morale phase, and the answer was they wanted to update and improve the rules because they quite liked it, and they introduced combat attrition, which I presume is the current rules as they are, but they've also introduced more things that are interacting with the morale rules themselves. Not really sure what, they didn't do any explanation on that, but they did say that morale in the past often felt binary, either it does nothing or your entire unit dies. And it also means that Night Lords and Reavers can do more on the table. Again, I have no idea what this references. It sounds like it might have other aspects to it, like such as target priority, which units you can shoot, how you can shoot them, whether you can use pistols in close combat. I have no idea, but it certainly looks like there will be more to morale. And this is something I've often called for, because like he said, the binary way of morale does nothing or lots. It's boring. There are a lot of units that ignore morale. There's a lot of armies that ignore morale for the most part. And then there are units that are quite susceptible to it. So it'd be good for it to actually do something and actually give terror troops that have a lot of theme and background in 40k, such as Night Lords and Reavers, a chance to actually enjoy their benefits. It was asked, will we see more units added to Warhammer Legends? That doesn't really feel like a rules-based question, but they said yes, eventually. They don't have great plans to do so. Eventually they will see a model or a unit here and there disappear into Legends. They don't want to carve great swathes out of the Codex books. Going back to the questions, point-sized games will dictate how many command points both players get. It was basically explained a little bit more depth that mission and size of the battle, so if you do 2,000 points and do certain missions, you'll have XYZ command points, which I think is quite an interesting way of doing it. Now, I really do hope that those missions do see requirements such as troops added to the army, because otherwise we will see people just ignoring all their troops choices and just going with the most killy, dangerous units on the board because they get the same amount of command points. Don't get me wrong, I'd like to actually take what I want in an army, so I can make my own themes, first company armies. I've always wanted an army of nothing but Terminators, things like that, and actually having them just as effective on the tabletop due to not having to worry about command points being found. That is very exciting to me. However, why would we use troops otherwise? So I did mention earlier that there might be a way of using troops to stop people from outflanking. Not necessarily in the rules, but cheap units to act as a distraction or a buffer to opposing units. That's quite an important aspect of the game, potentially. And you would have tactical squads, as an example, along the flanks of your army to try and protect for when these units come in. It's not going to stop a horde of gene stealers, of course, but it might slow people down. So yeah, I'm hoping that combined with certain dictates within a mission does mean that we will still see troops in games, particularly competitive ones. They did mention soup, which for most people who aren't aware, that is allies in an army. You know, you have a soup of flavour of Imperial units from different codex books. Well, they will now cost command points. So the example given was one player might pay some command points to send some troops off onto a flank, whilst the other pays command points to ally in a knight into their Astra Militarum army. Now that's quite a nice aspect. It means that people won't automatically just cherry pick the best units from multiple codex books. They'll take an army to a theme, or they'll take an army to a tactical method of playing, which I think is quite cool, and I'm looking forward to seeing that on the table. Last couple of relevant questions. Future of Codex books. They're going to take the best of Psychic Awakening, roll them into the new Codex books with the updated rules and the Crusade aspects. I'm sure they will actually update new rules there as well. There'll be appendix at the back of the book, as I mentioned, with the blast weapons, and we also know that it's going to likely have other aspects to it, such as the rare rules section and probably some more things. Hopefully some actual changes to Astartes chainswords. I think that's about it for most thing. I mean, we know about the other aspects that were talked about in order here, but I did them out of order because obviously they were relevant to other points that were being raised. So we'll go on to what my initial thoughts are. My initial thoughts are most of these rules, if not all of them, I think are going to be for the better of Warhammer 40,000. I'm quite happy to hear a lot of them. The command points is a particular favourite of mine, as is the terrain. I'm a player who likes to use elite models and elite units. I like the assault element of a game. I like to use multiple phases each turn, so having more options to do so, as well as outflank the opponents using my command points, feels like a very rewarding experience, and I'm very happy to see it. The use of the blast mechanic will be very crucial to getting some units on the table that aren't often seen, such as whirlwinds, which are dirt cheap and very useful, that are now going to be a very effective manner of dealing with hordes and larger units. We had no clarification as what constitutes a horde, but I imagine it will be a unit above 10, maybe above 15. Any less, and I think all units are going to start to suffer. And of course that would make blast weapons the go-to weapon of choice throughout most armies. So yeah, I'm liking those things. The only aspect of the game I'm a little bit worried about is how will the command points and the point size of each game dictate how people build their armies. I mean, if you don't need any limit, if there are literally no limitations of what you can take in any given game, we're not going to see many troops choices, I'm afraid. Even if you're going to try and prevent people from flanking, I worry that people will just not bother. They'd rather have an extra couple of assault units and just counterattack. I like to have a large number of troops on the table. I think if both players have that, it makes the game more balanced and it makes it a lot more fun. But I also like my competitive games, so I'm not sure what will happen there. It is a worry, but I'm kind of sure that holding objectives is going to be very troop dependent in this next edition, and I'm sure they have worked it out because they have been in communication with a lot of very competitive players in their playtesting stage. So surely that information has been given back. So I have a bit of confidence there, but we will see. I'm not really sure on anything else that I don't like the sound of. Everything else is kind of exciting. So yeah, that's it for me. That's the only thoughts I've really got regarding a lot of these ideas, because let's be honest, there's not much information. Comment below what your thoughts are on the subject. Let me know what kind of things you're looking forward to in Warhammer 40,000 in the next edition, and what kind of things you might even be worried about. Always interested in talking about it, and you never know, I might even talk about it in a new video. As always, please like and subscribe, and I look forward to speaking to you soon. Peace out.